Well, good morning again to those of you who've been on the line for a little while now, and good morning for the first time to those of you who've just dialed in. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on managing change through HR leadership. A very important topic to many of us, I'm sure, and something that we're going to really enjoy taking you through throughout this morning's session. Just as a brief introduction to get us started, my name is Katie and I manage the marketing for HiBob in the UK and across Europe. If you're not familiar with HiBob, we provide a HR and people management platform that really focuses on culture and engagement, as well as, of course, of covering off the more traditional elements of a HRIS. The platform that we provide is called Bob. And Bob works really well for fast-growing companies and companies that are very forward-thinking and innovative, which of course means companies that have to deal with a lot of change, and companies that really embrace change and sort of make every effort to understand the needs of the evolving workforce that we all have in the businesses today. And we provide the tech to support that as much as possible. However, as I'm sure we all know, managing change can't ever just be done by technology alone. There's such a huge people element involved with it. And it's much easier said than done. So we are really pleased to have Michaela Bartlam with us today, who is People Partner at Unleash and General Change Management Guru. Michaela's going to take us through some top tips on how you, as a HR leader, can manage change and some of the difficulties that might happen along the way, particularly when those changes involve multiple stakeholders or just people in general, I suppose. On your webinar screens, you should have the box where you can type questions. Please do so as we go through the discussion. If anything crops up that you'd like to hear more about or anything raises a question in your mind, just type that in the question box, and at the end of the session, we'll put as many of those as possible to Michaela. And any that we don't get the chance to answer, we will follow up with on email afterwards. So without delaying us any further, I'm going to hand over to Michaela, who's going to make us all change management experts. So Michaela, I'm just going to swap my screen over to yours.
Amazing, thank you so much.
So that should be up and running for you.
Cool. Great. Well, Katie, thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. That was completely brilliant. You should do my marketing more often. Amazing. Well, hi, everybody. It's so lovely to be here today. I thought I'd first off just explain a little bit about who we are at Unleashed and what we do. We essentially help businesses, so typically kind of really early stage scaling businesses, help them create really thriving businesses and places to work. So I think a lot of people reading this, whether you're a founder or from a leadership team, whether you're kind of from people or HR, are going to really, really resonate with the kind of three main challenges that we typically help customers with. So firstly, looking at how do you attract and hire the best talent. And I think this is especially prominent within startups when you might not actually have a kind of brand. Once you've been able to hire these amazing people and the best talent possible, and you've built a team, how do you keep them really highly engaged? How do you keep them super productive and really high performing? And then thirdly, how do you take sort of founders and a kind of management or leadership team from doers and executors to really incredible managers and leaders? So we craft and deliver really great people strategy. And that basically allows founders to really focus on driving a business forward from a commercial perspective. And I think really, really importantly to add here as well, because I think it's going to be, I suppose, a kind of thread in which I kind of my whole presentation today is going to be around, is that we're actually really far from HR. We're people, and we're experts in scaling. So the whole team have been within really fast-paced, high-growth scale-ups and startups. And so a lot of these things, we've done it all before, and we've really learnt along the way. So I think you've obviously all seen today's agenda, the kind of things that we're going to go through. So firstly, we're going to look at kind of how to improve communication between HR and C-suite. We're going to look at how to get managers and employees more involved. We're going to look at how to maintain clarity in communication when you're obviously communicating change, and also how to stay authentic in your HR leadership. And the thing is that I think typically when you hear about kind of change management, it kind of sounds, it sounds like, something that businesses go through that's really big, like a massive restructure. But actually in day-to-day businesses, the kind of, you're always dealing with change, whether it's really small change, or much larger change. So I think this is the kind of principles we're going to talk to today are going to be really easy to use, day to day, in startup life. So firstly, how to improve communication between HR and C-suite. My first really vivid thought on this is that there really shouldn't be a divide. I think it's so important for all businesses, especially kind of startups and scale-ups, to have a senior people person on their exec team. And I think this is actually a really good opportunity for us to make the distinction between HR and people. And it's something that I feel really strongly about, and all of the Unleashed team feel really strongly about. So traditional HR, this really kind of comes from a mindset of a management and compliance approach, and I strongly feel like this is completely the wrong philosophy for a kind of scaling high growth business, because it is constantly looking at the worst case scenario. So, is somebody underperforming? Do we need to fire somebody? And that kind of traditional HR kind of change management process really isn't much better either, because it comes from a place of putting a kind of generic process on top of a problem in order to fix it. And quite frankly, it very, very often doesn't actually fix the problem, because it doesn't take into consideration that people are actually human with emotions. They react differently to things, they absorb things differently, and it certainly kind of doesn't take into account any nuances. Ultimately, there's kind of no positive mindset, and there's no bias towards creating real positive practices. And that's kind of opposed to, having a kind of people team in place and having a sort of senior people person on the leadership team, and at sort of management level. That team is really driven by empathy, as opposed to humans being a resource that needs to kind of be controlled or policed. Let's kind of get this totally out in the open. Humans are not resources, they're people. So this kind of mindset is about having a real positive mindset that is assuming good and driving for excellence. So figuring out as a business, how do we motivate people? How do we get the best out of our individuals? It's much more focused on creating a positive practices and initiatives, all of which come together to essentially support business growth and really drive for high performance. So if we're thinking, in this situation, thinking about sort of change management, the job of a really good people person is to make sure that there is alignment across the leadership team and the wider team, which, when you're going through change, is completely vital. And obviously, naturally as well, that team are thinking commercially. So I think it's really, really important, and I would honestly advise this to any business, to make sure that you bring a good people person on at the right time. Otherwise, that person's going to be constantly firefighting, as opposed to actually thinking really strategically. At this point, I want to kind of clarify as well that I'm actually not going to talk through any traditional HR change management processes today. Instead, I'm going to focus much more on principles that you can consider and really use during huge times of change within a business, which I honestly think is much more effective. So with that in mind, what should be happening at leadership level, ideally with a kind of senior people person at the leadership table, is alignment. Really can't stress this enough. Understanding what the change is for and what the outcome will be. Like, this is literally the basis of everything. So moving on to kind of how to involve employees and managers with change management. So my first thought on this is really that in startups and scale-ups, change happens. Adjusting expectations that it's a startup and there will be change along the way, you know, it's ultimately kind of part and parcel of being part of a startup or a scale up. I mean, it's part and parcel of being part of any business, but I really especially feel that, you know, it's more evident in kind of small, high growth businesses. The people joining your team should really be aware of this and excited to kind of be on the speedboat. Otherwise, you know, ultimately they would have jumped on board an oil tanker. But ultimately they may need reminding sometimes. You know, you can do this by communicating the changes that have perhaps happened within the business since the beginning and reminding people that ultimately it's a roller coaster journey, but you know, that's sort of why we do it. Secondly, people aren't being dicks. Excuse my language, but I feel very strongly about this. People don't react defensively because they don't react defensively to change because they're being dicks, but because it's actually a survival instinct. You know, it's literally part of our fight or flight response to an extent. And it's really normal to be anxious about things changing in our environment. And the person announcing the change often forgets actually that they've been thinking about the change for a long time, you know, weeks perhaps. Then they announce the change and they typically then expect people to just be on board and actually forget that they too are going to need, you know, time to absorb it. I always think that, like, if you've been thinking about something, thinking about the change for, let's say, 2 weeks, it's a sure thing that actually your team are going to need 3 or maybe even 4 weeks to properly absorb it. And in addition to you having had more time, you've also had a lot more context along the way. So remember that people aren't being dicks. Just make sure that during these conversations, you're really open to people's objections and people's challenges and questions. And don't get defensive. I always think that really the best way to get people to be open and react well to something is to model the behavior yourself. So really make sure that you keep empathy kind of top of mind. And I think this leads on really nicely actually to my third point, which is you have to remember your tone. Completely in alignment with what I just said. It's really important in pitching the change as well. You know, if you sound stressed or you sound somewhat stressed or negative about the thing you're speaking about, the people within your organization are very, very likely to reflect your own emotions. So remember that the way you announce something, you know, your tone, your emotions, etc., that really influences everyone else in the room and how they absorb that information. So, you know, even the smallest thing, like, you know, your tone of voice can honestly either cause huge amounts of anxiety and insecurity, or on the flip side, stability within a business. So I think it's so important to be very, very clear and very deliberate about the way that you communicate, especially actually when communicating change. You know, you need to explain things in a much more nuanced way, and keep it super, super positive and collaborative. Next point. I think this is super important to remember, and it can so easily actually get forgotten sometimes, but communication is always a two-way street. So perhaps think about how to create a really safe space or a forum sort of situation for people to ask questions and communicate their concerns. And it's not as simple as just, you know, getting everybody in a room, because remember that people are different and people hear and absorb things very, very differently. So some people actually won't necessarily be particularly comfortable challenging the CEO or somebody in, you know, leadership or people leadership in front of the whole company. So perhaps give the kind of option to collect questions and opinions before to then sort of address during the forum. You know, this hopefully should really kind of incentivize people to be transparent about their concerns in whatever way they're kind of happy and feel super comfortable to do so. You know, there will always be things that people won't want to bring up in a group situation that are still super, super important to address, especially before they kind of become much bigger issues. So really make sure that you also give people the opportunity to speak with you one-to-one. You know, nobody wants to work somewhere where they feel like they have to really keep their guard up. So give people the space needed to really be open and honest and ask questions in whatever way they kind of feel comfortable. And leading on really nicely from that, actually, write everything down. Like, this is so important, and again, gets forgotten so often. You know, keep track of all of the questions and all of the pushback made about the change, because even if one person asks a question, you know, just because maybe one person or a few people asked a certain thing or pushed back in a certain way, doesn't mean that they're the only ones who didn't know the answer or kind of felt the same way. So it's so important to make sure that you write down everything, and that is then posted somewhere super public, like a kind of internal wiki or an intranet or whatever you kind of internally call it. Because also some people absorb things differently as well, and absorb things better perhaps when they have space to read something and absorb it that way. Plus, actually, on a slightly side note, it's also really good for onboarding. And it also means that you can really consolidate the messaging to be in line with your kind of company values. So even sort of reading something, you know, a new person, for instance, can really understand how a decision was made based on your values as a company. And finally, challenge with warmth and some concerns that may be raised. People may not actually be that clear on why they're upset about a certain change. And I think if you don't know, don't assume. Perhaps that concern or kind of anxiety is actually being triggered by something that you literally have no exposure to. You may be able to resolve their concern quickly, you may not. In trying to get to the bottom of it, though, I think asking why can sound quite accusatory. So sometimes perhaps something along the lines of, you know, hey, thanks so much for raising this. Let's kind of talk through the areas that you're finding a concern so that I can understand better. I just, you know, find that actually, you know, that kind of approach means that people are a lot more open to talking with you, because it feels much more collaborative than just, you know, why don't you like this? Great. So maintaining clarity in communication. So the first most obvious point to make, I think, here is the journey. And I really cannot stress this enough. Bring people along on the journey. Explain the why, from initial concept to implementation. You know, make sure that people understand, is this functional change versus is this change over time? You know, as a company, are we preempting change in order to plan for the future of the company? Why is this change important? Can you kind of liken this change to changes made in the past? You know, if so, talk about the kind of positive impact that change had. Is this change a solution to something? Perhaps explain what you've thought about and how you've made that decision. You know, perhaps was it just you making this decision, or were there others involved? So, really give people all the context needed to really understand how this change happened. And following on from that as well, communication. Ultimately, as I was saying before, people are different. People will hear things differently. So make sure that you communicate in different ways and really meet people where they hear the message. I think it's so important on this note to really remember that when it comes to people, unfortunately, input does not equal output. And that's really, really important to remember. Different people will understand the same message in different ways. Because naturally they put their own personal slant on things, and that's always going to happen. So it's just super important to make sure you're communicating in different ways. Alignment. Oh, I could talk about this forever, but I really, alignment from exec level to line managers, really make sure that your message is straight, and that the leadership team and line managers completely understand the why behind the change. Because ultimately, even if you are the one who is announcing the change to the wider business, those people, those leadership teams and line managers are going to be having many more kind of one-to-one conversations. So, they have to understand and be completely aligned with the why. But also, it's really important actually for those people to really ensure that they tailor the message to those individuals based on their motivations. So I really hope that everybody listening in today, that you have managers that are really sensitive to what different individuals on their team are motivated by, and sometimes more importantly what they're demotivated by. I hope they understand how those people learn best. If you don't, I really, really think that needs to be addressed. I don't want to go off on that tangent today because we'll be here forever. Perhaps that's a webinar for another day. But yeah, that's really, really, really important, because ultimately, if you're the one delivering the message, the onus is not only on you to keep that message going. So make sure that the rest of your managers are really, really aligned and dedicated to that message. And obviously remember as well that some people genuinely find change significantly harder than others. Hopefully as well, you and your sort of line managers should know who those people are. So just go and talk to them. Just be human and go and speak to them. Yeah, and finally, in the same vein, checking in with people, in the aftermath, I think, of announcing change, it's so important to check the pulse of where people are with the change. So, naturally do this by going out and speaking to people. But I think also feel free to seek out those kind of in the know people. It's difficult to put a term on it. I'm not quite sure what those people are called, but I feel like every company has these people, because ultimately people might not actually be totally honest with the CEO or with people at kind of leadership level. But these kinds of internal influences might hear and actually be able to give you some really great insights into where people are with kind of accepting this new change and this new information. So I think that's a really, really important point. And it's not sniffing around. You're doing it in people's best interests. So so feel free to go and do that. So moving on to how to kind of be more authentic and transparent in your HR leadership. Or your people leadership. I'm gonna rephrase that slightly. So my first thought and kind of problem with this is the kind of idea about like how to be more authentic, because I really kind of feel like if you need to try and be more authentic, you might actually just be in the wrong career. It's just empathy. It's just try and be as empathetic as possible, and make sure that you have the right information to do your role correctly. So understand the why and make sure that you don't, ever go into a conversation where you are, unsure about the reasons. Make sure that you've got that under your belt before going into the conversation, and then just be empathetic. It's that sort of simple. Secondly, don't try and build an empire by yourself. So what I mean by this, quite bluntly, is don't hog information, share it. Also, don't not say or share things in an attempt to protect people. I really hope, and your business really should be full of adults, and they should be able to cope. But what you need to do, whether that's from a kind of leadership level or from a kind of people or HR level, is really figure out how to help them cope. So kind of by all means, use the kind of practices and principles that we've discussed today, but don't wrap them in cotton wool. Just be open to talk and be open to kind of say, I don't know. But don't be an information hog or overly proud, because it's just patronizing. And I think people react really badly to that. And lastly, leadership. Being part of the leadership team, you really need to make sure that the change you set out to achieve is on track, and that throughout that process, everybody is kept in the loop, ultimately that the message remains really consistent. So again, make sure everyone's on the same page within your leadership team, as you really never ever want to have mixed messages. I think that's honestly the things that's perhaps the most kind of anxiety inducing for people, is when they're kind of hearing mixed messages from a leadership or kind of management team. So that's really, really important to keep top of mind. So I wanted to kind of address this. So as a people person, what happens if you're not part of the C-suite, or and you're not necessarily on board with the change? And actually, to be honest, this probably is also relevant for people who are at that leadership level and do have a seat at that table. Sometimes you may just not agree. You may not understand and agree what the change is, and I think that's totally normal. I think for the people who are listening in today, we've probably all been there at some point. So my thought around this is that ultimately it's your role to understand the change, and sometimes it's okay not to agree with it, but try to understand why you don't agree with the change. Is it just because it's big and scary? Quite possibly. And again, that is totally normal as well. It's a human instinct. But perhaps look at it from a kind of more commercial, strategic perspective, and at that point, do you feel the same way? I think look at it from different perspectives and accept that sometimes you may not agree, and sometimes also the decision might just be out of your hands. Ultimately, you still need to do your job, and you still need to communicate as a member of the team. So try and be as kind of neutral as possible, and kind of remember, those different perspectives, and hopefully, that will really help you advocate for the change. So to summarize, I think if you're here today listening, if you're listening to this afterwards, if you're going to take anything from what I've spoken about today in terms of really great, strong practices and principles to remember and to kind of implement when going through huge changes within a business, it's these. Firstly, alignment, alignment, alignment. I know I keep harping on about this, but I honestly believe that if there's one thing that's going to make a team feel super anxious and really insecure about a specific change, however big or small that is within your business, it's going to be hearing an inconsistent message from the leadership team. So really just make sure that your message is completely straight, and that the whole leadership team, including all of your line managers, completely understand and are actually really confident communicating the why behind a change. Explain the why, again, leading on really nicely from that. It's all about the journey. You have a group of people who have actively stepped onto a speedboat with you And ultimately, sometimes it's going to get really choppy. I think people should really understand this, and should understand that there's going to be a lot of change along the way. Hopefully they understand this at the point of accepting your job offer. But I think at each point that this happens, make sure that they understand the why. Understand why the change is happening. Where has this change come from? Explain how the decision were made, because ultimately you naturally have context because you've been thinking about it and you've been thinking about it for a long time. And naturally, therefore, it makes complete and utter sense to you. But don't expect others to understand in the same way that you do without that context. And finally, remember that your team are human. They will absorb the information in totally different ways. They'll absorb it at different speeds. They will communicate their concerns differently. Perhaps they won't communicate their concerns at all. Just be prepared for all of that. And similarly, make sure that you communicate in different ways as well, in groups or sort of forums, one-to-ones, through line managers. I think it's just super, super important to really meet people where they hear the message and just give them time to absorb it. And I honestly think that, like, if you do these kind of three things and you keep these three things top of mind, it will make the whole process so much simpler. And also, I don't have a specific slide for this, but cut yourself some slack as well, because this stuff is really difficult. And, within businesses, we all go through the same things. So talk to people, kind of remember these points that we've kind of discussed today. And hopefully you'll kind of be as happy as these ladies dancing in confetti, and and it will all go well. But yeah, those are kind of my sort of thoughts around change management. And it's not a kind of process that you just put on top of things, but it's actually just remembering, it's remembering these three things basically, and kind of using those and implementing them to kind of really ease the pain of change within a business. So there we go.
Thank you so much, Michaela. That was so useful. Even as a non-HR person, I took an awful lot away from that. So hopefully all of the people managers who've got dialed in did as well. It's always strange, I think, when you come to the end of the webinar, because you can't hear the individual rounds of applause that I'm sure you're getting in the hundreds of offices across the UK and Europe at the moment. But it was a great session, thank you. We've had some really interesting questions come in along the way. And if anyone's still thinking of questions, please do send them over, and we'll ask them. We'll ask as many as we can. But to get us started, I have a great question here from Sophie, who's asked, how can we train people in the C-suite who have a more traditional HR mindset rather than a people mindset?
Oh gosh, that is a really, really good question, because this actually happens a lot for sure. Sometimes it is sometimes, I think, easier for people to see a process and put a process on top of something, because it's straightforward, it's kind of easy to kind of follow. But I think ultimately it's really reminding people about the kind of human element. People are different, and people react differently to things and learn differently. And I think the problem with so many kind of processes, or HR kind of processes that sometimes people at management level think are still really, really brilliant, is that perhaps they speak to a certain percentage of your team, but actually everybody is different, and that process only really is good for maybe a small fraction of the people in your team. So I think it's just really reiterating, and it's a long process as well, and there are certain things obviously you can do, but reiterating that people are human, and that we really, change is difficult, and we really need to do lots of different things to make sure that we really do meet people where they hear something. Or it's a little bit like taking the sort of change management point, because obviously that's what we've been speaking about today. People hear things differently, they absorb things differently. So you really have to make sure that, just putting a process on top of that isn't going to fix anything, because it's only going to speak to a small proportion of the people in the team. And I think just trying to like really reiterate that, that, maybe maybe this process, for instance, is going to make a couple of people happy, but it's, not going to affect the majority of the team in the way that you really want it to. So I think, yeah, it just comes back to that point of your team are human, and they need to be kind of treated as individuals, as opposed to just sort of robots that you can sort of pop a process on top of.
Thank you. I think that covers that really nicely. And it's funny how easy it is to forget that we're actually dealing with humans and people when you get caught up in that corporate environment.
Totally, absolutely. And we've all seen it as well. But I think, yeah, it's this kind of people mindset that I keep sort of talking about is there's some amazing companies out there that are doing really, really well. And I think the kind of happiness and engagement of those teams is kind of evidence that it actually really does work. When you treat people as individuals and figure out how to motivate individuals and things like that, and how to get the best out of them, that is kind of evidence enough in many ways.
Great. So we've got some more questions, all very much around the C-suite, really. So one of the big questions that's come up from a couple of people actually is, how can you teach the C-suite to be more empathetic if it's not their natural way? Or can you teach them?
Yeah, can you teach people to be more empathetic? It's getting quite philosophical, isn't it? I mean, like, I would like to think that you can teach people to be more empathetic. And maybe it actually is about making them more reflective of themselves as well, because they're going to really understand the fact that they react well to things, they're motivated by certain things, they're demotivated by certain things. So maybe it's actually just a kind of an education piece around, okay, so like, as a person, you're really motivated by this XYZ. What demotivates you? And actually pointing out the kind of differences between, people aren't just like that. I actually saw a really interesting quote the other day by Richard Branson, that I was kind of reading, and it really struck a chord with me, because it was basically saying about how, in order to build really brilliant culture, build a kind of place, a kind of place to work that you really want to work in. And whilst that's a lovely idea, I actually really disagree with it, because once again, it's actually only looking at a certain type of person that's exactly like Richard Branson. And so I think that kind of empathetic piece, and actually kind of trying to teach people around, about how different people are motivated and how those people need managing slightly differently, because you want to motivate them in certain ways, you don't want them to become demotivated. Everybody has different personal values, and everybody wants to work in different ways, in the same way as they react really well to certain sort of things. So I think there's absolutely a kind of exercise there for trying to educate and sort of teach people, perhaps at C-suite level, that just people are different. And if we want to kind of make this a really brilliant place to work, where everybody's really motivated and everybody wants to do the best work possible for a business, then that's the kind of point really to kind of to focus around. It's a difficult one though. I'm not sure you can necessarily teach people to be more empathetic, but I think you can teach them a sort of more black and white sort of black and white view of, okay, this is what you're demotivated by, but you're all different, and sort of keeping that top of mind, so that when you're communicating with people, or when you're dealing with something like this, when you're announcing kind of change, you're really factoring that into the way that you do it.
Great, thank you. I think there's a quite a famous study as well that shows that the most successful people in business tend to have quite a high score on the sociopath scale. So I think it's trying to teach people who aren't naturally empathetic how to be empathetic sounds like quite a big puzzle to solve.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
In the same category, I think the other million-dollar question that if you can answer, I think you can solve a lot of people's problems, is do you have any advice on how to align a leadership team that have tendencies to disagree?
Good question again. These are great questions, and totally million-dollar ones, because I feel like you can have, again, everybody's different, right? So you can have a really brilliant leadership team who are coming from things from totally different perspectives that aren't actually going to agree with things, right? And I think that's actually really healthy, to be honest, because if you have a leadership team that think about things in totally the same way, that agree on basically everything, you're not ever actually getting that kind of devil's advocate, and you're not really, you're just literally getting one point of view, and that's obviously not going to work particularly well. And I think it really comes back to the kind of point that I was making, in terms of, like, if you actually aren't on board with the change, the point I was making earlier in the presentation about, actually trying to make that team look at things from different perspectives, explaining, and articulating well why they on a particular topic perhaps are not aligned, and trying to help those people see things from different perspectives, and asking people to kind of reflect as well and look at things from different perspectives, and seeing if they feel a different way. But I do actually think that it's important sometimes to actually have those different perspectives and keep that individuality within a leadership team, because I think it would be actually more of a nightmare if everybody was in complete and utter agreement with everything, and we're thinking about things in the same way and kind of prioritizing the same stuff. But again, you do need to have a certain amount of alignment in the end within a kind of management team. So I would really suggest actually kind of sitting everybody down and doing a bit of an exercise on, looking at different perspectives, understanding where certain people within that team are coming from, and trying to find a bit of common ground on, whatever the kind of topic is that you're talking about. Hopefully that will kind of, allow people within that team, even if they're thinking about things from a slightly different perspective and in a different way, it'll help them kind of advocate for and understand and sort of empathize with the kind of points of view of other people at the table. And also just, again, bringing it back to that kind of commercial sort of strategic perspective, trying to remove the sort of an emotional element of people having specific opinions about about a certain thing that are causing misalignment within a team, bringing it back to the kind of the business side of things as well, and looking kind of at it in more of a black and white perspective too is also a kind of good trick for that. So yeah, those will kind of be my two sort of pieces of advice in terms of how to kind of help a sort of leadership team find more alignment, when there isn't any.
Great, thank you. And so we've actually had quite a few questions. I think we've only really got time for one more, but the questions that have come in are very much all around similar themes of empathy, leadership qualities, and being heard. So we'll make an effort to try and follow up with some content that hopefully addresses those areas a little bit more. But just to finish this off, I think a very important question for the whole audience, for people managers as a whole, is how can HR or people managers make sure they always get a seat at the table when change is being discussed?
Yeah, good question. Because I think it doesn't, especially maybe slightly more traditional businesses where that kind of traditional HR piece sits. It's not always the case that that person's going to have a seat at the kind of leadership table. And I do think that that really has to come from above, actually. It kind of needs to come from, you know, ultimately, if you are a kind of HR or people person, you can't, you know, literally walk into a management meeting and sit yourself down and and address the whole team necessarily. But, you know, I think that actually it's really, really important. And I think, you know, there are lots and lots of businesses that do this really, really well and make sure that they have that kind of people person at the table. But I think in terms of kind of convincing people at sort of leadership level, kind of C level, that it's really, really important, you know, it's going back to what I was kind of saying at the beginning about the kind of the importance of, you know, having as a sort of people team and a senior people person at that table. It's, you know, about driving empathy and you know, having kind of slightly different mindset that's much more positive and it is kind of really driving for excellence. And, you know, sitting down with the kind of leadership team to kind of really explain that, you know, it's not about, you know, when, you know, we're thinking about a certain way of doing stuff in terms of people, you know, it really is coming from a place of how do we motivate and get the best out of people. And, you know, there are going to be lots and lots of experts and sort of great people out there that have a huge amount to offer and a completely different perspective. You know, naturally, you know, what we find sometimes at Unleashed is that, you know, founders and you know, and management teams, they've all been hired and they all have a seat at that table because they are specialists in a specific field. You know, they're specialists in product or marketing or sales. And none of those people necessarily, you know, think that they are excellent people. You know, everybody's kind of work in progress. Everybody's getting better at being a manager all the time. So I think, you know, making, you know, arguing the fact that your dedicated senior people person actually is an expert in that field and has a huge amount to offer in terms of the best way to motivate and get the best out of individuals. I think that kind of argument really should be, you know, it should really resonate highly with founders and leadership teams because, you know, this stuff is really, really important, and not everybody at that leadership level can be an expert in how to do that. So, you know, making the argument for actually having somebody who really specializes and is an expert in that field to give the perspective of, to give that kind of people perspective.
Thank you. I think that seems like a really nice place for us to finish. And thank you so much for all of the points and all of the answers to those pretty tricky questions that you managed to give. It's been such an insightful session, and I'm sure we're all going to take away an awful lot from this. So we've had actually lots of people asking as well if we're going to share the slides, which of course we will. And Michaela has also kindly offered to create a blog for us as well to share some of her key findings on this topic. So
yeah,
we'll.
And any of these other questions as well, I realise that we only got time to answer a few, so I'll make sure that, you know, that hopefully some of the additional questions I didn't get time to talk about today are kind of included in that blog post, so that, you know, we're really covering off everything. But thank you so much for having me. It's been amazing.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone who's dialed in to join us. As always, we'd love to hear your feedback and any topics that you'd like to see on future webinars. So thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.